I always felt like a fish out of water when it came to getting my friends home. The glamour of my life on New York's Upper East Side didn't match the reality that haunted me at home. My father, John, was a doorman at one of the most luxurious buildings in the city, and this simple truth made me ashamed. People often associate wealth with prestige, and my father, with his blue uniform and badge, seemed to be in a completely different world from mine. Imagine if they knew? I thought, as I watched my friends chatting excitedly about their vacations to exotic places. It was easier to talk about luxury properties and summer homes than to admit that my father spent hours in a small cubicle, fulfilling his duty to ensure the safety and comfort of the residents. That day, after a get-together at school, I decided to try to impress them. You won't believe it. My father once worked as security at a gala event. He says he met a lot of celebrities. I lied, trying to take the focus off what our lives were really about. But instead of being amazed, they just laughed, not really believing the story I was telling. I felt a lump in my throat. The feeling of being an imposter was growing inside me. When I finally got home, the atmosphere was heavy. The sun was setting, casting long, cold shadows over the small apartment. My father was leaning against the kitchen table, a tired expression on his face. He seemed to have carried the world on his shoulders after another exhausting day of work. "Hi, Dad," I said, trying to sound casual, but the shyness in my voice betrayed my effort. "Hi, Ethan. How was your day?" he asked, his voice low, a glimmer of hope in the expectation that I would tell him something interesting. I didn't want to give him what he expected. Normal. The school, you know how it is. Group work and stuff like that. I looked away, unable to face the reality unfolding before me. How could I explain to him that I was ashamed of our life? That I felt like a burden when I talked about my father to others? The conversation that followed was a game of short questions and answers, full of empty spaces that I didn't know how to fill. "Ethan, you know you can talk to me, right?" He tried to encourage me, but I could only nod in response. It was easier to avoid the conversation, to avoid confronting the truth that was hiding behind the door of our lives. The silence stretched between us, heavy and uncomfortable. I felt like I was running away from what really mattered, but I couldn't find the right words. "I'm just tired, Dad. Tomorrow is another day," I said, trying to end the conversation. I got up to go to my room, but before leaving, I heard her deep sigh. "If you need me, I'll be here, son." That phrase echoed in my mind as I walked down the hallway. It was a promise he always kept, even when I didn't care to listen. I closed the door behind me, but I couldn't escape the feeling that I was somehow missing something important. My father's life, with all its difficulties and sacrifices, seemed to be slipping away from my hands like sand. I didn't know I was about to discover the true essence of what it means to be rich. The life I so despised could, in fact, teach me valuable lessons. But for now, I was still trapped in my own selfishness, unable to see beyond my pride. I woke up the next day with a strange feeling in my stomach. Sunlight filtered through the curtains, but there was no heat on my skin. The news about my grandmother's health was still ringing in my head. My mother had received the call in the evening, and I knew she was distressed, but the idea of being the gatekeeper for a day made me even more nervous. What did I, Ethan, an upper-class boy, know about being a doorman? The only thing I knew was that my father, John, did this every day, and I had always felt a pang of shame about it. As I got dressed, I grabbed my father's uniform. The smell of the fabric reminded me of afternoons when he would come home, tired, but always with a smile on his face. I looked in the mirror and, for the first time, I didn't see a rich kid, but rather a young man who was about to face a completely different world. "You can do it, Ethan," I muttered to myself, but inside I was panicking. I went down the stairs of the building and, when I opened the door, I was greeted by a cold wind that seemed to test me. The entrance hall was luxurious, with shiny marble and impressive chandeliers. But there, amidst the opulence, I felt small. As soon as I set foot at the reception, I noticed that the residents were already passing by without looking at me. Most of them didn't even notice that I was the new doorman. I sat behind the desk, somewhat awkwardly, trying to appear confident. When the first resident appeared, a woman dressed elegantly, I greeted her. "Good morning, ma'am. How may I help you?" She looked at me with disdain, as if I were a fly in the ointment. "Where's John?" he asked, almost ignoring my presence. My heart raced. "Today it's me, Ethan. I'm replacing my father." She stared at me for a moment, then rolled her eyes and left without a word. I felt my face heat up. It was difficult to bear the frustration. I was already beginning to understand how my father could feel sometimes, dealing with people's indifference. The day went by, and with each hour that passed, I felt more exhausted. The tasks were simple, but the residents' resistance left me frustrated. I tried to keep busy sorting mail and cleaning up the area. When I finally managed to help a resident with a heavy order, he just mumbled, "Thank you," without looking at me. "Hey, you're doing a good job," said an elderly woman who used to talk to my father. "I'm Mrs. Thompson. I appreciate your help." I felt momentary relief. "Thank you, ma'am. I'm just trying to do my best." She smiled, and it made me feel a little more accepted. "Your dad is an incredible man. He's always here to help everyone. It's not easy what he does." I listened to her, but I didn't know what to say. It was the first time that someone recognized my father's efforts in front of me. The day continued, and I faced more disdainful looks, but also some kind words. Each interaction helped me understand a little more about the life my father led. When it was finally time to end my shift, I was exhausted. I looked around the hall, now a little more familiar, and thought about everything I had been through. "You were very brave today," said Mrs. Thompson as I prepared to leave. "Remember, a person's worth is not in what they do, but how they do it. Your father knows that." This kept echoing in my mind. I wasn't just a janitor's son. I was a young man who was learning the value of dignity and respect. When I returned home, my father had not yet arrived. I sat at the kitchen table, thinking about everything. The idea that I could see my father in a new light was something I had never imagined. His life was full of challenges that I didn't understand. And suddenly I realized that perhaps true wealth was not in having, but in being. When the clock struck 8 in the morning, I was already up, wearing my father's uniform. The light blue shirt and awkward tie felt foreign to my body, and I felt like an actor in a play I didn't want to be in. As I walked to the door, my heart beat faster, not from excitement, but from a mix of fear and shame. What would the locals think of me? The image of the doorman's son, a nobleman living upstairs, wouldn't leave me alone. Upon opening the building's door, I was greeted by a sharp wind that announced the freezing New York morning. The lobby was large and luxurious, with shiny marble and modern designer furniture. However, I couldn't help but notice the faces of the people passing by me. Some just ignored me, while others looked at me with a mixture of contempt and indifference. I felt invisible, as if my presence didn't matter. "Ethan, you can do this," I thought. "It's just one day." Right at the beginning of my shift, an elderly woman appeared, dragging a full grocery cart. She looked at me curiously and, as she approached, she smiled. "You're new here, aren't you, darling?" His voice was warm and engaging, and for a brief moment, I felt a little more at ease. "Yes, I'm Ethan. I'm filling in for my dad today," I replied, trying to sound confident. "Ah, John, he's a good man. Always so kind," said Mrs. Thompson, as she began to unload the cart. As she spoke, I realized there was something special about the way she referred to my father. The pride in his voice was undeniable. "You know, your father has helped me many times. One time, my elevator broke down, and he went up to my floor to make sure I got there safely. It's not every day we meet someone like that." I was surprised. I had never thought about the impact my father had on people's lives. I just saw him as the one who carried boxes and opened doors. "He's a good doorman," I murmured, trying to absorb the new perspective. "Not just a doorman, young man. He is the heart of this building. And your work is important, even if you don't realize it," she continued, with a kind look. "You should feel proud of him." Those words began to touch me in a way I hadn't expected. As I helped Mrs. Thompson carry her groceries to her apartment, my mind was racing. I observed the lobby, now full of life, and the residents' interaction with my father. Some greeted him warmly, while others ignored him completely. It was strange how my perception of him and how others saw him were so different. At that time of the morning, a grumpy man, Mr. Jenkins, walked past me without even looking. I knew him well. I always made a point of ignoring my father, but now I was in his place. "Good morning, Mr. Jenkins," I tried to say, but he just snorted, looking away. I felt a lump in my throat. My fingers curled into a fist for a moment, and I wanted to scream. Why can't people see the value in someone's work? I thought as I struggled to maintain my composure. As the hours passed, my perception began to change. I saw the doormen talking to residents, helping them with packages and deliveries. There was a camaraderie that I hadn't noticed before. I started paying attention to how each of them dealt with their daily challenges. It was as if, suddenly, I was seeing the world through my father's eyes. "You know, Ethan," said Mrs. Thompson as she helped me organize some things in the lobby, "the dignity of a job is not in your position, but in the way you do it. Your father was always an example of that." And then, in the midst of these reflections, I realized that my day as a doorman was beginning to change me. The difficulties he faced were not his alone. They were ours. And for the first time, my shame was dissipating, giving way to a deep respect for the man I called father. The day dragged on, but there was a new energy in me. As the sun moved across the sky, I felt like I was no longer the same boy that hid behind the walls of the mansion I grew up in. The reception routine had its peculiarities, and I was beginning to realize the importance of my new role. As I sorted through the mail and opened the door for the residents, one of them, Mr. Mitchell, approached me with a smile. "Good morning, young man. How are you doing?" he asked, with a friendly tone that made my heart warm. "Actually, I'm adapting. It's different from what I imagined," I replied, trying to hide the insecurity in my voice. Life here can be complicated. But remember, respect is one of the greatest gifts you can give and receive, no matter what you do. Everyone has their role, and everyone is important," he said, looking into my eyes with an intensity that made me reflect. "Yes, I understand," I murmured, as I thought about how I myself had disrespected my father's position in the past. "Your work is important, isn't it?" "Of course. And yours too, even if it's just for a day. People may not realize it, but a doorman is often the first to know what happens in the building, which is more than you might think. You are the front line, and when you treat people with dignity, it comes back to you in some way," he explained, gesturing with his hands. I was so engrossed in his words that I almost didn't notice when a resident approached, Mr. Harris. He was one of the ones who always ignored me, and the expression on his face was one of contempt. "Who are you? Where is the real doorman?" he snapped, his voice thick with disdain. I tried to stand my ground. "I am Ethan, Mr. John's son. I'm covering my dad's shift today." "Son of a doorman? Is this a joke? What do you know about our lifestyle? You can't even imagine what it's like to work hard," he continued, laughing sarcastically. At that moment, a flame of indignation lit inside me. I had felt the weight of my father's work throughout the day, and I wasn't going to let anyone take him for granted. I took a deep breath, deciding it was time to defend myself. I may not know everything, but I know my dad works hard every day to make sure this building works. He is a man of dignity, and that is more than you can say for many here," I replied, my tone firm. Mr. Harris was silent, surprised by my reaction. He did not expect resistance. "You have no idea what you're talking about, kid," he finally said, but his voice was less aggressive. "Maybe not, but I'm learning, and I'm starting to understand that a person's value isn't in what they do, but in how they do it," I declared, my voice echoing in the small entrance hall. Mr. Mitchell observed the scene, and a discreet smile formed on his face. "Good job, Ethan. Sometimes you have to raise your voice so that others can hear," he commented, approving my courage. The day continued, and although there were still challenges, I felt like I was growing. Every interaction, every look of contempt or gratitude, shaped me. I wasn't just the doorman's son. I was beginning to see myself as a defender of the dignity that my father represented. As the shift was coming to an end, I looked around and realized how precious this job was. It wasn't just about opening doors or collecting packages. It was about being a constant presence in many people's lives. The way each person reacted to my presence and my efforts began to show me the true value of respect and empathy. I left the lobby that day with a new perspective. My heart was lighter, and my mind was clearer. Now I knew that true wealth was not in money or status, but in the ability to respect and value the dignity of every human being, regardless of their position. And in doing so, I finally felt like I was beginning to understand the man my father really was. The hours began to pass slowly, and I still felt like a fish out of water in that environment. The reception routine continued, but something inside me was about to change. As I tried to adapt to the rhythm of the day, a sudden commotion took over the building's lobby. A scream cut through the air, and in an instant, everything was silent. Mr. Thompson, one of the oldest and most respected residents, collapsed on the floor. My heart raced. What do I do? I thought, trying to remember something that could help me. The people around began to stir, some screaming for help, others just watching, paralyzed by fear. I knew I couldn't stay there, helpless. I took a deep breath and, in the firmest voice I could muster, shouted, "Someone, call an ambulance. He needs help." I ran over to Mr. Thompson, still lying on the floor. His face was pale, and I knew something needed to be done. "Mr. Thompson, can you hear me? Stay with me," I said, trying to remain calm. He didn't respond, but I couldn't give up. Then I remembered something I had read about first aid. My heart pounded in my chest as I checked his pulse. It was faint, but still pulsing. Residents began to mobilize. A woman came forward and began doing chest compressions, while I held Mr. Thompson's head, trying to keep him comfortable. I looked at the faces around me and realized that, in that moment, we were all one, joining forces to help. "Come on, guys. We need someone to call 911 now," I yelled, and finally saw one of the residents run to get the phone. The minutes seemed like hours, but finally the ambulance siren began to echo. Immense relief washed over me when the paramedics walked in, ready to take care of Mr. Thompson. The team quickly took control of the situation, and I walked away, feeling my legs shaking. As I watched the paramedics work, a strange feeling began to settle in my chest. What I had done there was not just an impulsive action. I had acted as part of the community. My father, who always considered his work a mission, was right. The responsibility he carried was not just a task. It was a commitment to the lives around him. When the ambulance finally left, and the lobby began to empty, I noticed that the residents were looking at me differently. The contempt I had felt earlier had turned into something I never expected: respect. I was approached by Mr. Mitchell, who approached with a smile. "You did good, kid. Sometimes what seems small to some is all someone needs." "I just did what anyone would do," I replied, but he shook his head. "No, Ethan. You had courage and took action. That's what defines a true man. Your father should be proud of you." His words rang in my mind as I made my way home. The air outside the building felt different, fresher. I was changed. Experience has taught me that the value of a job lies not just in status or pay, but in its ability to impact lives. When I opened the door to the house, I found my father sitting on the couch, a tired smile on his face. "How was your day, son?" he asked, and I realized there was much more to the question than just superficial curiosity. I did something important today," I began hesitantly. "Mr. Thompson passed out and I helped. I called 911, and everyone came together to help him." John looked at me with an expression that mixed concern and pride. "Ethan, you did what you thought was right. That's what matters. I didn't know how important what you do every day was. How you help people," I said, emotion filling my voice. "I feel like I finally understand." And in that moment, the walls I had built around my heart began to melt. I looked into my father's eyes and knew that true wealth was not in material possessions, but in the connections we formed with others. The next day, I woke up earlier than usual, determined to surprise my father with a special breakfast. The night before had been eye-opening, and I was still reflecting on everything I had learned throughout the day as a doorman. I wanted my father to know that I respected him, that I finally understood the dignity of his work. With that in mind, I prepared pancakes, bacon, and fresh coffee. The aroma of food was beginning to fill the kitchen when, suddenly, something caught my attention. While looking for a clean cup, I saw an old letter hidden among the beads. Curiosity took over me. The paper was yellowed and the edges were frayed, as if it had been stored for a long time. I hesitated for a moment, but the desire to find out what was there overcame my hesitation. Carefully, I pulled out the letter and opened it. What I found inside left me speechless. It was a letter written by an art gallery, praising an artist's talent. The words described a young man with an unusual gift, someone who had the potential to be recognized across the country. The artist's name? John. My father. My heart raced. How did I never know about this? I looked at the date and realized it was from many years ago, before he decided to take on the doorman job. The weight of discovery began to settle in my chest. When my father entered the kitchen, still with sleepy eyes, I couldn't hide the letter. He frowned when he saw me holding that piece of paper. "Ethan, what are you doing with that?" he asked, a tone of concern in his voice. "Dad, what does that mean?" My voice was shaking a little. "Why didn't you ever tell me you were an artist?" He sighed, as if the memory had taken him to a distant place. "Ah, Ethan, that was a long time ago. I had dreams, yes, but responsibilities changed everything. When your mother and you arrived, I could no longer afford to dream. But you had talent. You could have been recognized," I replied, still in shock. "Why did you give up on all this?" "Because life isn't just made up of dreams, son. Sometimes you have to make difficult choices. True wealth is not in fame or recognition, but in the ability to take care of those we love." He approached, and I could see a deep sadness in his eyes. I didn't know. I'm sorry I didn't see how much you sacrificed. I was so embarrassed that you were a doorman, but now I see. You are much more than that." My voice was choked. "I wish I had known the artist you were. Ethan, I don't want you to feel sorry for me. What I did for you. And if there's one thing I'd like you to take away with me, it's that you should never give up on your dreams. No matter how difficult life becomes, follow what you love. That's what really matters." I felt a wave of mixed emotions. Admiration, sadness, but also a new determination. "I promise I'll remember this, Dad. I'm going to look for what makes me happy." He smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his face. "And that's all I could ask for, Ethan. Life is full of challenges, but also of opportunities. And whenever you feel lost, remember, true wealth lies in being true to yourself and your loves." At that moment, I realized that the vision of wealth I had was superficial. My father wasn't just a doorman. He was a man who had made profound sacrifices for the love of his family. The dignity he maintained in his work now resonated with me in ways I never could have imagined. At that breakfast, as we prepared more pancakes together and shared laughter, I knew I had found something more valuable than any material wealth: the love and truth that unites us. This was the true wealth I had always sought, and finally, I had found it.